Before we start this podcast, have a look around your house. Maybe your compression boots are in the cupboard, your massage gun on the shelf. Maybe you're lucky enough to have a red light panel or a home sauna. Well, do these recovery methods actually work? Why do we spend so much money if the science doesn't really back it up? Well, in this podcast, we're going to be going over all things recovery and going over what recovery methods actually work and what is worth spending your money on. So welcome to 168 Hours, Episode 5, The Recovery. Welcome to 168 Hours. This is a podcast where we go over science in sport. Today will be recovery. We go over current news in triathlon, current kit within triathlon, and new technology that you can use in your training to give you that little bit extra on race day. Today, like I said before, is recovery. And before we get into what recovery methods actually work, I think it's important that we all understand what recovery actually is and what is happening after we train. And there's a couple of things that happens. So when we train, it's essentially controlled damage to our bodies. We have little micro tears in our muscles, our glycogen stores deplete, and our nervous system gets stressed, so it needs to recover after training. Inflammation also rises, and our body needs to adapt to this by recovering. And we do this primarily in two ways, and that is by having a good diet and your nutrition is on point, and by having a good night's sleep. And these are the two methods that science suggests. And the science backs up that nutrition and sleep are the two methods you need to have spot on recovery. So recovery automatically happens when we sleep. If you get in between 7 to 9 hours per night, your recovery is going to be pretty good. And in fact, after we drop off underneath 7 hours, that is when our recovery suffers. If you start going into the 6 hours 45, 6 hours 30, 6 hours and below 6 hours, well, you're putting yourself at a real risk of injury. So what happens when we sleep? Well, our body, like I said before, recovers. Our muscle protein synthesis peaks, that is a mouthful, and our nervous system resets. And this happens when we sleep, which is why sleep is so important for recovery. So when you get in less than 7 hours, you're effectively waking up still sore, and you're waking up not primed for your next training session. And this doesn't just need to happen after hard sessions, easy sessions. These things still happen and we still recover in our sleep. And then there is our diet and our nutrition. So I'm not just talking about your fancy supplements that you've got in the fridge or in the cupboard. I'm not talking about the protein powder, the creatine, melatonin maybe if you're using that to help you sleep. I don't know why that came to my head, that's quite random. But nutrition is the key factor in recovery as well as sleep. And what I mean by this is having enough protein so your muscles can recover, enough carbs that you feel energized, and enough fat to keep you recovering. Not fancy supplements, but a solid nutrition base. Yeah, like we see in school, the plate with the green bit on, the carbs, the meat. I essentially just point people back to that and back to basics. Because when your nutrition is not overcomplicated, this is when we see recovery going faster, and not exactly faster, but when you see recovery being, well, done properly, and you wake up feeling recovered and ready to go. So these two methods, sleep and nutrition, although food obviously costs money, sleep doesn't cost anything, and nutrition costs very little to what you're probably paying on these fancy recovery methods. The compression boots, the massage guns, the saunas, and the red light panels. But boring, and which is what these recovery methods are, sleep and nutrition are boring, which is why amateur athletes tend to skimp out on sleep and nutrition, because they don't make recovery happen faster than it should. Recovery happens naturally in nutrition and sleep, but what we look for as amateur athletes is for recovery to be accelerated. And this is where these massage guns, these compression boots, the heat, the ice baths all come into play. But we'll get onto this a little bit later. Essentially, every recovery method falls into three categories. They either work and they make massive gains of recovery. So this is your sleep and nutrition. They make marginal gains, very small gains that may work for some people, but don't work for other people. And this is the next kind of section of recovery. This is maybe heat. Again, it probably doesn't work as much as you've been led to believe through all the marketing. And then we have the last section, which is it doesn't work at all. So the three sections of recovery. It works, it's been proven to work, and you need it to recover: sleep and nutrition. Marginally works, causes marginal gains, and then the last section doesn't work at all. But why are we led to believe, and it might work, we'll get onto this later on in the podcast, but why is all these accelerated recovery methods in the media, on social media, and being marketed to us? Well, recovery is essentially a multi-billion-pound industry. The amount of money that has been pumped into the promotion behind these recovery products, it's crazy. And the growth of these recovery methods, the growth of compression boots, saunas, massage guns, is being driven by marketing and not by science, which is what we're going to now go into. But before we get into this, takeaway one, to save you money and save you spending on these expensive recovery recovery methods is, number one, fix your sleep. Under 7 hours, no product will save you at all. Above 7 hours, your recovery is going to be pretty spot on, between 7 and 9 hours. A consistent bedtime beats a perfect bedtime. Get a consistent bedtime and wake up time if you can. Your recovery will be better. Wind down 30 to 60 minutes before bed. No strenuous activity. Try and limit stress. Avoid heavy meals and alcohol 3 hours before bed, because this just absolutely wrecks sleep. And then, if you're not measuring your recovery through these fancy technologies, step one is to measure your sleep first. And this doesn't mean wearing a fancy watch. Measuring your sleep simply means measure how many hours of sleep you're getting per night. At the end of a week or 2 weeks, add this up. If you're consistently getting over 7 hours, your recovery should be pretty much spot on. Takeaway two, consistent recovery beats intensity. And what I mean by this is basic recovery, day-to-day, sleep and nutrition will beat getting in your compression boots or getting in the sauna once a week. A 10-minute walk after a hard session will beat and this is extreme, but will beat a 45-minute ice bath. And the 10-minute walk will probably have a lot more benefit for you. A proper post-workout meal, again, will accelerate your recovery, help your body refill, and it will beat any fancy supplement in your cupboard or your fridge. And to kind of round off, this is proven. nutrition and sleep as recovery is proven by science, used by elite level athletes. And going back to the Norwegian method, which we talked about a couple of episodes ago, the Norwegian trainer method, the Norwegians treat recovery as the fourth discipline within triathlon. This is how important it is, but as amateur athletes, for some reason, we constantly neglect nutrition and sleep and try and find a faster, not even easy way, because sleep is so easy, but a faster, more fancy way, because we've been led to believe that the fancy ways of recovering are more effective than sleep and nutrition, and this is simply not true. But this is not just me saying this, and this is just not my position. The science backs it up. So firstly, heat. Now heat has had massive amount of research around it. So heat within endurance sport is certainly has its place, but its place is not so much for recovery, which is what you have been led to believe. The marketing around a sauna is get in the sauna and you'll feel better for your session tomorrow. You'll feel more recovered. However, the evidence is extremely mixed. For some people, there are very small benefits. For other people, there are no benefits. And for some people, there's adverse effects, which means it has a negative effect on their training. And this is backed up in a study where they looked at, so a study essentially looked at other studies, and it was 9 acute studies in total. And what it found was, like I said before, 4 times heat. In this case, it was hot water immersion, so people were getting in a hot bath after a workout and then doing the workout again. 4 studies had no effect. 4 studies had a marginal beneficial effect, and 1 had adverse effect. So, extremely mixed. Probably not what you have been led to believe, which is that heat works all the time. It most certainly doesn't, and the science is backing this up. The sport breakdown across this heat studies, because as triathlete it's quite tricky that we need to factor in 3 sports. If it works, what might work for running might not work for swimming, and this is exactly what this study showed. So 4 athletes in these 9 studies were part of an endurance sport. 4 had power and sprints as their sport, and 5 used isometric force. And what these findings found out was that swimming, when people swam, went in heat and then swam again, the performance actually declined. This is crazy. We have been led to believe that heat will have a positive effect on our performance. Well, this study and other studies have actually shown that it has a negative effect. So this study showed that swimmers doing 4 times 50 meters all out, then recovered in heat and then done it again, has slower splits after the heat than people doing passive recovery. So there were 2 groups. One got in heat after the first workout to recover. One just had passive recovery, kind of just sat down, recovered normally. And the heat group had worse first splits than the people who just had passive recovery. So according to this study, heat had a negative effect. And what this shows is if you're going for a hard swimming session, probably don't go in the heat before, because it's going to have a negative effect. But what about cycling and running? Are there positive effects there? Well, the truth is no, or very, very slim. Probably, again, not what you would expect from the marketing. And the studies that conducted a 5K time trial and then exposed people to hot water immersion after one 5K, and then they done another one, And then they also had another group doing passive recovery, again just sat around normal day-to-day recovery, showed no difference in times. Apart from day 3, when the heat group was slightly, marginally higher. But what about cycling? The findings in cycling mirror those that were found in running, and they were just marginally higher. There was no benefit really of going in the heat for recovery and then doing another session than there was just passive recovery. And I'll say this throughout the podcast, is the marketing strategy behind recovery loves the fancy recovery and wants you to spend money, when in fact you should just be using nutrition and sleep. And this is what the science also suggests, at least in terms of heat. There was also another study where people done a Wingate test, and if you don't know what that is, it's a very hard cycling test, essentially. And they put one group, again, passive recovery, one in heat, and they done the test again. So they done the test, gone in heat, or one group went into hot water immersion in a hot bath at 40 degrees, and then another one just had passive recovery. And this study did show some benefits, but what it concluded was those benefits come from the athletes being more warmed up after the heat water immersion than those just going into the test essentially cold. So heat didn't have an effect on recovery, but it had an effect on the warm-up and allowed athletes to get started faster. So according to this study, we should have heat before a session if we want to start off faster. Whereas in long distance triathlons, 70.3s, even Olympic sprint, super sprint, we could probably make the case for. But again, if it's having a negative effect on swimming, you probably don't want to do it. But heat probably doesn't work for recovery, but may have marginal gains before a cycling or running session. But why is all the hype around heat in sport? Well, it certainly does have a place in endurance sports. I went over this in the last episode of the podcast with my good mate who is doing a PhD in heat physiology. So if you want to find more about heat's place in endurance sport, such as acclimatization, what we should do when we're racing in the heat, and strategies for heat, go and watch that podcast and then come back here to find out what recovery methods actually work. But there's also been studies that show with the heat long-term cardiovascular health, which is another benefit, and which is why heat is being promoted, is because it can essentially make you healthier in the long term. And there are multiple studies proving this. We won't dive into those today because I want to go over multiple more recovery methods. But if you're getting in the sauna or going in heat for a long period of time, and I mean kind of months, then you're probably going to find long-term cardiovascular health benefits. And again, heat does have a place in endurance sports because it helps athletes racing in the heat. And one quick way you can do this, if you're training it in the UK, especially during the winter, but are racing in the heat in the summer, is do your session and then jump in the sauna immediately after. But again, we go into much more detail in the last podcast. So make sure you go and check out that one and then come back here. So the takeaway, heat absolutely has a place in endurance sports, but heat doesn't really have a place in your recovery. Just spend the time eating and sleeping rather than an hour in the sauna trying to feel better for tomorrow's session, because it's not really going to work, or at least that's what the science is suggesting. And I'd love to know your thoughts, so make sure you kind of comment below and let me know. So on the other hand, we have cold and ice baths. Now, there is an awful lot of research done. There's an awful lot of research done around ice and ice baths, and what the science suggests is it doesn't help. It doesn't help recovery. And I'll say it again, ice baths do not help recovery. What they do is reduce soreness in muscles. This doesn't mean that your muscles are recovered. And there's a very good case for if you get in an ice bath to feel recovered and then doing a session immediately after, you're actually increasing your chance of injury because your muscles are not recovered. They just feel less sore. So let's get into this. So what ice baths do is reduce your perceived soreness. They essentially make you feel better than you actually are. It doesn't actually fix the damage that you've caused from a session. And then, so cold essentially masks the signals of pain and soreness without fixing or accelerating your biology, in a way. And the concern that no one discusses is how this can affect you as an athlete. So what does it do? It reduces perception without accelerating recovery. And what this means is if you've done a hard session tonight, gone an ice bath tomorrow morning, and then done another hard session tomorrow night because you feel good, you're gonna really increase your chances of getting injured because you feel good when in fact you're not. And it can put you at a really high risk of injury. But there are also other concerns that come with ice baths, and that it can mask minor injuries and then turn these into major injuries. Because ice baths reduce our perceived soreness in our muscles, these minor injuries are so easily ignored that we can then go and do another session before something goes pop and we are out for 6, 8, 10 weeks. So ice baths reduce healing in a way and can cause injury. So don't use ice baths for recovery because you could be putting yourself at a lot more harm. The rule around this is never ever train 30 to 90 minutes after an ice bath because your chances of injury go up a lot. They reduce your nerve conduction essentially to your muscles, and you have slower reflexes within your muscles, so at least this is what the science is suggesting. So don't train 30 to 90 minutes after an ice bath. In my opinion, I would recommend not doing a heavy session around a day after an ice bath because you might be masking these minor injuries and they could then turn into major injuries. So what do ice baths actually do, and why have you been told that they cause recovery or accelerate recovery? Well, what they do again is just reduce soreness. But when you get in an ice bath, it reduces your muscle protein synthesis. And this fills the micro tears in your muscles so you can then recover. So like I said at the start of the podcast, when we train, we recover. When we train, there are little micro tears in our muscles, and protein essentially fills these micro tears and our muscles become bigger and stronger. But cold actually reduces this for hours on end, and the post-workout window when this heightens is when we sleep, or 4 to 24 hours after a workout. So if you want to build muscle or strengthen your muscles, muscle protein synthesis is exactly what you need. So by getting in an ice bath, we then restrict this and it can have a negative effect. Or not so much a negative effect, but it can stop the effects of actually training. So cold plunging 4 to 24 hours after a session can actually have a negative effect on your gains after a session. And what it does, so there is something called mTOR, and it essentially acts as a switch in your body and it activates muscle growth. So mTOR acts as a switch to activate muscle growth within your body. And when we get in a cold plunge, it suppresses this mTOR after training. So again, it's very counterproductive after a session. And it explains the negative strength gains in the meta-analysis after a session. So that's kind of your cold plunges. That's kind of my case to remove cold plunges from training and recovery entirely. Because it does reduce soreness, but it blunts mTOR and reduces MPS, muscle protein synthesis. Skip cold plunges entirely after strength, or at least this is what the science is suggesting, because it has negative effects. So, in a nutshell, cold plunges make you feel recovered. They don't actually recover you more. They actually increase the risk of injury. You feel better after a cold plunge, but your muscles don't. And this is because your mood goes up, but your muscles don't recover. So remove cold plunges and cold from your recovery process entirely. But what it does do is, like I said, increase mood, mental well-being. It can have a massive effect on mental well-being. Again, there's a lot of science behind this, and I'm definitely not qualified to talk you through the science behind your mood and your mental well-being. But the science is suggesting that it has a massive effect, or at least I think it's between 30 to 90 minutes after. So yeah, there is a case to get in a cold plunge, but there's not a case to get in a cold plunge for recovery. In a nutshell, cold plunges are not useful for actually recovering you. They are useful for perceived recovery, but this can actually cause injury. Ice and cold plunges are great for masking pain, but not great for actually getting rid of this pain and recovering you more. So again, remove cold plunges from your training. The last one I kind of want to go over is red light panels, because these are quite new, coming into kind of on trend, and you see more marketing around these. And in all honesty, I'm probably not the most qualified person to give you advice on red light panels, because there is so much science that I'm not yet educated on to actually talk about. But the research around red light is genuinely mixed, and there's probably not enough around it to make a conclusion into whether you should actually use these day-to-day recovery. Again, I know people do get in them and they can be used with saunas, but I'm not going to say use them or don't use them. Maybe that's for another episode entirely. So they are the three recovery methods that I wanted to go over, because they are what's kind of on trend at the minute. And if you want an episode or want to find out more about a certain recovery method, then make sure you let me know. You can either go to limitx.org and let me know, chuck us an email, or just let me know in the comments. But when we're talking about recovery, I feel like we have to talk about Whoop and these new Aura rings. So firstly, Whoop. Whoop's latest recovery score update. And what it does, and I'm going to just read a bit here, but Whoop has released updates in its recovery scoring algorithm. The recovery score has always been Whoop's signature metric on a scale of 0 to 100. And Whoop, for their recovery method, combine HRV, so your heart rate variability, your resting heart rate, your sleep, and your respiratory rate to tell users how ready the body is to actually train. So what is heart rate variability? Or this is something that I used to get confused by. And what it is heart rate variability is a tiny healthy variation in time intervals between consecutive heartbeats. Well, that was a mouthful. It's controlled by our automatic nervous system, reflecting the balance between stress and relaxation. So, to make sense of this, if you're in a stressful situation, HRV is likely to go up. At least that is my understanding of it. But people always come to me, should I use Whoop? Well, Whoop is essentially an educated guess on how recovered you are. You can use it and it can be accurate, but not for everyone. So I wouldn't tell people to automatically go to Whoop, because you tend to let the metrics and the numbers take over the way that you actually feel. And this shouldn't be the way it should be. You should be going off how you feel and how recovered you are, rather than let a number tell you that you're ready to train or not ready to train. So, recovery score from Whoop is a summary of your night's sleep, and it doesn't take into account date. Well, it does, but not to a level that you should maybe always trust. It's, in my opinion, Whoop's the most accurate recovery tool out there, but should you let it dictate your training? Probably not. So use Whoop essentially as the data and a guidance, but don't use Whoop as a coach. And there are also other kind of recovery methods out there that you can use. There's the new Oura rings that have just come out, and HRV apps. For amateur athletes, some HRV apps just let you kind of take it. I think it's in the morning or in the evening, and there's kind of a daily 1 minute measurement, and it's kind of more useful than continuous data for people that numbers take over their life. This is probably a lot more useful because you're not constantly checking apps and watches. You're just taking this 1 minute maybe in the morning, and you can kind of see a roundup, in other words. So, in a nutshell, if you'll actually take 1 minute every morning to measure HRV with an app and a chest strap, you don't need the hardware, the Whoop. You can save your money. If you know that you won't take this consistently, because this is what it needs to work, is consistency, then Whoop or Oura rings will do the job, and the convenience will justify the cost. But make sure, again, going back to it, that nutrition and sleep are on point first. But in a nutshell, these are very expensive. So yeah, get your sleep and nutrition on track first. If you still want that bit more data, then go for a Whoop, an Oura ring, even a HRV app. In a nutshell, heat has mixed reviews, not as much as you actually think. There's a strong long-term case for heat to increase your cardiovascular health. Cold reduces soreness, doesn't make you any more recovered. And red light therapy, I'm kind of not touching at the minute. We'll maybe research a bit more and do a whole another episode on. And that's the science segment. That's an extended version of this science segment. So, the news within triathlon. This podcast will come out slightly later than anticipated. So this news is going back last weekend, if you're watching this on the weekend that it come out. And there was Krakow 70.3. And Kasper Stepniak won. I'm pretty sure it was in his home country, on home soil, which is every triathlete's dream, to win in your home country. Second place in a 70.3 was only 20 seconds back. And this just argues the case for triathlon being so exciting. We endure 3 hours, 3.5 hours worth of racing, and it comes down to 20 seconds. This just builds a case for transition being an extra sport, getting these marginal gains that pros try and do, drafting it in the swim, and different things, carbon plate shoes. All this technology comes down and gives you those extra 20 seconds for Stepniak to get over the line first. Nikki Bartlett won the women's in 4:08. She exited the swim actually in 8th place and was 1 minute and 41 seconds back, which is huge, which is quite big. Her bike absolutely carved through the field, and she led before I think it was before 45 kilometers were left, and then held that lead. Both athletes won under extreme pressure, and those times are not for the faint-hearted. Stepniak won on home soil, what every triathlete dream of, but Bartlett had more planning and patience and absolutely carved through that field in the bike leg. There was also the Norseman, which is argued to be the toughest triathlon in the world. The winner for the women's came over in 12 hours and 4 minutes, and it was decided in the final meters, because second place came over in 12 hours and 7 minutes. Now this is the toughest triathlon in the world, and to have a time gap between first and second place of that small is huge. And then third place again was 12 minutes, that would be insane. 12 hours and 10 minutes back. And this was the women's race. So to give you a bit of context, the Norsemen, they jump off a ferry at 5 a.m. in a cold, dark lake. Thousands of meters of elevation on the bike, and the marathon ends up one of the biggest mountains I've ever seen in my life. 2,000 meters of altitude at the finish, which is crazy. There's only 250 places in this triathlon, and they have around 8,000 participants, and that is up 27% in the last 3 years. Sorry, that is up 270% in the last 3 years, which just shows how much triathlon is growing and endurance sport in general, and how many more people believe that they can do extreme races like the Norseman. So if you were one of these people applying for this race, fair play to you. It's definitely on my bucket list, but I'm definitely not in a place at the minute to be doing such an insane race. This is the hardest single race on the race calendar in a calendar year. 2 winners, same day, opposite stories this year. But imagine, tying it back to the episode, imagine the recovery needed after this. Absolutely insane. Recovery isn't a nice to have, it's an absolute survival method for races like the Norseman and Ironman races. In a nutshell, that was really the news from last weekend. And like every episode, I simply tell you what I've done with my last 168 hours and where I am in terms of my hamstring update. The hamstring is coming on nicely. I should be running back within 2 weeks. We're going up to Ironman Leeds to watch one of the Limit X athletes. So we'll be going up there. I'm going to try and run up there. That'll be 3 weeks from when I last saw the physio, which is why you give me as kind of a rough guide. But we're nearly there. It's been a long 16 odd weeks with a hamstring injury that just never seemed to be moving forward. My last 168 hours has been largely spent in the gym. Well, it has been spent in the gym. Leg exercises, hamstring rehab. It's been boring, but much needed. I can't wait to be back on the bike, back running, and back swimming. 2027 presents a new challenge for my racing. Ironman Wales, multiple 70.3s, and hopefully get another race on the calendar soon. Let me know how your 168 hours has gone and what you have got coming up within the next week. So, I hope you have enjoyed episode 5 of the 168 hour podcast, all about recovery. Let me know if we missed anything in the comments. Like always, like always, thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next one.